The small town of Maplewood was known for its peaceful streets and tight-knit community. People knew each other by name, and secrets were hard to keep in a place so close-knit. But tonight, something was about to shatter that tranquility, and it would start with an accusation. Officer Miller was just finishing his shift when the call came in. It was strange. Late-night calls were always a little unsettling. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky, but it was clear. Something had happened at the church. A tip-off, they said. And that was all Officer Miller needed to hear. He grabbed his keys, put on his uniform, and stepped out into the cold night. As he arrived at the church, he saw something that didn't seem right. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only one car parked at the back. It was Pastor Samuel's old station wagon. The church stood quiet, its tall, dark windows reflecting the moonlight. "Can I help you, officer?" A voice called out from the shadows. It was Pastor Samuel himself. His usual calm demeanor seemed a little more distant tonight, as if something weighed heavily on him. The pastor had been a beloved figure in the town for years. Quiet, humble, always ready to help. No one could imagine him being involved in anything that could harm the community. Yet there was something in his eyes, something guarded, that made Officer Miller uneasy. "I got a call," Officer Miller said, stepping closer. "They said something happened here, something about you." The pastor didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at his shoes for a moment, as though trying to gather his thoughts. "It's not what you think," he finally spoke. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of tension in it. "I swear I've done nothing wrong." Officer Miller frowned, unsure of what the pastor meant. "Then why am I here? Why are you the one they called me about?" Pastor Samuel hesitated. "I don't know, but I think someone's trying to set me up." Officer Miller looked at the pastor with suspicion. "Set you up for what?" The pastor's face darkened. "For a crime. A crime I didn't commit." Just then, a voice shouted from the direction of the church doors. It was loud and panicked, echoing off the walls of the old building. "The pastor's a liar. He's not who he says he is." Officer Miller turned to see a man storming down the steps of the church. His face was red with anger, and his fists were clenched tightly. The man was familiar. He was Pastor Samuel's right-hand man, Daniel. They had worked together for years, and yet the rage on his face made Officer Miller pause. "What's going on here?" Officer Miller asked. Daniel's eyes were wild as he stormed up to the pastor. "You can't keep hiding it. Everyone's going to know what you did. You've been pretending to be this kind, caring man, but you're a monster." The pastor's face went pale. "Daniel, please," he whispered. "This isn't the way to handle this." Daniel was shaking with fury. "You think you can keep the truth buried. You've been using the church to hide your crimes, but now people are going to know the truth, and you won't be able to hide from it anymore." Officer Miller stepped between them, trying to keep things under control. "What are you talking about, Daniel? What's going on?" Daniel's gaze was full of contempt. "Ask him. He knows. He's guilty, and now he's trying to cover it up. He's done terrible things, and now the truth is finally going to come out." The accusation hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating everything around it. Officer Miller looked back at Pastor Samuel, whose face had drained of color. The silence between them felt like it could last forever. He had never seen the pastor so shaken. Something wasn't right. "Is this true?" Officer Miller asked, his voice firm but laced with doubt. Pastor Samuel took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "I'm not guilty of anything, but I know what Daniel's talking about, and it's not what he thinks." Before Officer Miller could press further, the church doors creaked open again, and a woman stepped out. She was one of the regular churchgoers, her face pale and filled with concern. She had been inside during the commotion. "Officer, please, you have to understand," the woman pleaded. "There's something wrong with Pastor Samuel. He's been acting differently lately. We all noticed. He's hiding something, and now it's all coming out." The accusations kept coming, one after another. First Daniel, now the woman. Each new word felt like a heavy weight, adding to the mystery of what was truly happening in the church. Officer Miller felt a sinking feeling in his chest. He had known the pastor for years, but now, the quiet man who had always been a figure of trust and strength seemed to be unraveling before his eyes. "I don't know what's happening here, but I need to get to the bottom of it," Officer Miller said, more to himself than to anyone else. As he looked at the pastor, he saw a man who was broken, not by guilt, but by the weight of something much darker. The truth was out there, but the question was, how far was he willing to go to uncover it? The tension in the air was thick, and Officer Miller knew that what he uncovered next could change the town forever. Officer Miller stood still for a moment, taking in everything that had been said. The church was eerily silent, the only sound the occasional creak of the old wooden beams. The pastor was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he clutched the collar of his jacket. The woman who had stepped out of the church was still watching him with eyes full of suspicion. It was clear now that something far bigger was at play here than a simple misunderstanding. Something had been brewing in the town for a while. And tonight, it seemed the lid had finally been blown off. "Pastor Samuel," Officer Miller began, his voice steady, but filled with concern. "What is all of this about? What's going on here?" The pastor swallowed hard, looking between Daniel, the woman, and Officer Miller. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a tight line, as though he was holding back a torrent of words. Finally, he spoke, but his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I never wanted anyone to know," he began. "But now, it's too late. The truth is coming out." The woman standing behind Officer Miller took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, officer," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This man, this pastor, has been hiding something for years, something that could destroy this town." Officer Miller turned toward her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to piece together the puzzle. "What exactly is he hiding?" The woman hesitated, then took a deep breath, as though summoning the courage to speak. "I've been attending this church for many years," she began, "and for all those years, I've seen things. Small things at first, little cracks in the pastor's facade. But the more I watched, the more I realized something was terribly wrong." She paused, glancing nervously at Pastor Samuel, who avoided her gaze. "I was there one night when he confessed something in a private prayer. It wasn't meant for anyone else to hear, but I was close enough to overhear him talking. And that's when I realized what was happening." Officer Miller felt a chill run down his spine as he looked between the woman and the pastor. "What did he say?" he asked, his voice quieter now, sensing the gravity of the moment. The woman hesitated before replying, her voice barely above a whisper. "He admitted that he was involved in something terrible. Something so terrible that if the truth came out, it would ruin him. And it would ruin everyone in this town. But he didn't stop there. He said he had been trying to bury it for years, using the church to keep people from finding out." The air in the church felt heavier as Officer Miller absorbed her words. "What kind of thing are we talking about here?" he asked, his stomach tightening with unease. The woman shook her head, her eyes welling up with tears. "I don't know the full story, but I heard rumors, whispers about a man from the past, someone the pastor used to know. A man with a dark history and a connection to Pastor Samuel's life before he came here." Daniel, the pastor's right-hand man, stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "She's right," he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "The pastor's been hiding his past for years. And it's not just a little secret. It's something much worse. He's been lying to everyone here. He's not the man you think he is." Pastor Samuel's face turned even whiter as Daniel's words hung in the air. Officer Miller looked between the two men, sensing the tension rising. "Daniel," Officer Miller said, trying to regain control, "what exactly are you accusing him of?" Daniel looked at him with wide, desperate eyes. "I'm not accusing him of anything. I'm telling you the truth. Pastor Samuel was involved in something terrible before he came to this town. He's been hiding the truth about who he really is." The pastor finally spoke up, his voice strained but steady. "I never wanted to be anyone's hero," he said, his gaze fixed on the ground. "When I came to this town, I thought I could leave everything behind. But now it seems that the past has caught up with me." Officer Miller's mind raced as he tried to understand the implications of what was being said. What kind of past could this man have that would lead to such anger and betrayal? What secret had he been hiding all these years? Just then, another voice interrupted the conversation. It was one of the older women from the congregation, Mrs. Ellen, who had been quietly standing near the church entrance. She spoke with a voice full of concern. "Officer," she said, her voice trembling, "I've heard rumors too. But you need to understand something. Pastor Samuel saved my life. He gave me hope when I had none. Whatever is happening now, it's not the man we know. It's not who he is now." Officer Miller turned toward her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "But if he's hiding something so big, how can we ignore it? How can we just let it go?" Mrs. Ellen shook her head, her eyes filled with emotion. "I don't know what happened in his past, but I know the man I've known for all these years. He has always been there for us, for this community. We can't just throw that away." The weight of the situation pressed down on Officer Miller as he stood in the church, trying to piece together the fragments of the truth. The pastor's past, whatever it was threatening to destroy everything he had built here in Maplewood. And yet there was a part of Officer Miller that couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was more to this story than anyone realized. The night was far from over, and the answers were still out of reach. But Officer Miller knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning. The tension in the church was unbearable. Pastor Samuel stood at the pulpit, his face pale, the weight of what was unfolding around him pressing heavily on his shoulders. His hands gripped the edges of the wooden surface as if it was the only thing holding him together. Officer Miller paced slowly, his eyes shifting from the pastor to the others in the room, trying to make sense of the conflicting emotions surrounding him. Daniel stood with his arms crossed, his face a mix of anger and frustration, while Mrs. Ellen, the older woman, stood near the back of the room, her eyes filled with sorrow as she glanced at the pastor with unwavering loyalty. The room was filled with questions that no one knew how to answer. The quiet murmur of the congregation outside the church only added to the growing sense of unease. Officer Miller's mind raced. There were too many pieces to this puzzle, and they didn't fit together easily. "I need to understand," Officer Miller said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "What exactly are we talking about here? What happened in Pastor Samuel's past that has brought us to this moment?" The pastor's eyes flickered briefly to the floor, and for a long moment, he didn't say a word. The weight of the truth seemed too heavy to bear. But finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't hide it anymore," he said, his throat tight with emotion. "I've tried to bury it, but it's been following me for years. The man I once was, it's not who I am now." Officer Miller's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to the pastor. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. Pastor Samuel sighed deeply, the sound of his breath hanging in the air. He looked up at Officer Miller, his eyes filled with regret and pain. "Before I became a pastor, I was involved in things I'm not proud of," he said, his voice shaking. "I made decisions that hurt people, that destroyed lives. But when I found faith, I thought I could change, that I could leave that past behind. But now it's all coming back." The room was silent, each person absorbing his words, trying to process what they meant. Officer Miller's expression softened, but he was still skeptical. "What kind of things are we talking about? What happened?" The pastor closed his eyes for a moment, as if reliving the memories he had buried for so long. "I was part of a gang," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't start out that way. I grew up in a broken home. And when I was young, I made terrible choices. I got involved with people who didn't care about anything but themselves. I did things I can never take back." Daniel stepped forward, his voice filled with bitterness. "That's not all. He's been lying to everyone. He's been telling people he's changed, but that's not the truth. He's still hiding things." Officer Miller turned to Daniel, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" Daniel's hands shook with frustration as he spoke. "I know more than anyone. Pastor Samuel wasn't just a member of some gang. He was a part of something much worse, a criminal network that was involved in trafficking. He's been running from that life for years, and he's used this town as his safe place." The accusation hung in the air like a dark cloud. Pastor Samuel's face turned an even deeper shade of white. "Daniel," he said quietly, his voice laced with sorrow, "you don't know what you're saying. I left all that behind. I swear to you, I left that life behind." But Daniel shook his head. "You left it behind. You've been lying to everyone, pretending to be someone you're not. You're still running from the past." Mrs. Ellen, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Stop it, Daniel. We don't know what happened. We don't know the full story. All we know is that Pastor Samuel has been there for us. He's given his life to this church. He's helped us through so much. But at what cost?" Daniel shot back, his voice rising. "At what cost to the people he left behind? At what cost to the ones he hurt? This isn't just about helping the community anymore. This is about facing the truth." Officer Miller stood silently, processing the exchange. He had always believed in justice, in getting to the bottom of the truth. But as he watched the emotions play out in front of him, he wasn't sure what the truth was anymore. The pastor had confessed to a past he could never undo, and yet there was a part of him that wanted to believe the man had changed. But could anyone truly change? Could the past ever really be left behind? "I don't know what to believe," Officer Miller said quietly, his eyes fixed on the pastor. "You've admitted to something terrible, but there's still so much more that needs to be said. What are you hiding?" Pastor Samuel's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Mrs. Ellen, his voice breaking. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he whispered. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." The room was filled with silence once more. The accusations were out in the open now, and the weight of the pastor's past hung heavy in the air. No one knew what would happen next, or how things would unfold, but it was clear that this moment had changed everything. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, as if every word spoken had the power to change everything. The truth about Pastor Samuel's past hung heavy in the air, and yet it seemed as if no one truly understood the full scope of what had happened. Officer Miller's eyes were fixed on the pastor, his gaze filled with a mixture of suspicion and empathy. The confession about the gang, the past he couldn't escape, was just the beginning. What followed next would be the revelation that no one could have prepared for. Daniel stood frozen, his face twisted in a mix of anger and disbelief. He had thought he knew everything about Pastor Samuel, the man he'd once respected, but now he felt betrayed, unsure of what was real anymore. "This doesn't make sense," Daniel muttered, shaking his head. "If you've changed, if you're truly different, why are you still hiding things? Why do you keep running from your past?" Pastor Samuel stood silently, his hands shaking slightly. He looked at Daniel, his voice a quiet whisper. "I can't escape it, Daniel. It's always there, always watching me. And now I fear the consequences will catch up with me." Mrs. Ellen, still standing at the back of the room, took a hesitant step forward. Her eyes softened as she looked at the pastor, and for a moment it seemed as if she could see the pain in his heart. She had always trusted him, believed in him, but now the weight of his secrets seemed to be unraveling the very fabric of their community. "I know you've changed," Mrs. Ellen said softly, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "But you have to understand that some people will never see you as anything other than what you were. They will never forgive you, and they will never let you forget." Pastor Samuel nodded solemnly. "I know," he replied, his voice cracking. But what they don't understand is that I'm not running from my past anymore. I'm running from the people I hurt and the lives I destroyed. The room fell silent again. The words hung in the air, and the gravity of the situation seemed to weigh down on everyone. Officer Miller's expression hardened as he processed the implications of the pastor's statement. "What people? What lives?" he asked, his voice calm but heavy with curiosity. Pastor Samuel closed his eyes, as though bracing himself for what he was about to say. "Before I became a pastor, I was involved in a group much more dangerous than just a gang," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "We weren't just stealing or fighting. We were hurting people. People who didn't deserve it. People who trusted us. People who had nowhere else to turn." A chill ran down Officer Miller's spine as the weight of the pastor's words sank in. "What do you mean? What kind of hurt are you talking about?" Pastor Samuel opened his eyes, his gaze distant. "I was part of a human trafficking ring," he said, his voice filled with shame. "We took people, destroyed their lives. We sold them, forced them into situations they couldn't escape. I was a part of that. And when I found faith, I knew I had to change, but no matter how far I ran, no matter how many good deeds I did, the guilt always followed me." Daniel's face went pale as he realized the full extent of what he was hearing. His eyes filled with disbelief as he tried to process what Pastor Samuel had just admitted. You were a part of that?" he asked, his voice shaking with anger. "You were involved in something so horrible?" Pastor Samuel's face twisted with pain. "Yes," he said, his voice almost breaking. "And I wish I could undo it. I wish I could change everything. But I can't. All I can do now is try to make things right." The room was eerily silent. No one knew what to say. The words that had just been spoken had shattered everything they had believed about the man they had once trusted. The very foundation of their faith in him was crumbling before their eyes. Officer Miller, his expression somber, turned toward Daniel. "This is the truth. This is what we're dealing with." His eyes returned to Pastor Samuel. "But it's not just the past that we have to confront. We need to know what you're hiding now. If you've really turned your life around, there are people who need to be held accountable." Pastor Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret. "I know," he whispered, "but I can't do it alone. I need your help." For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Officer Miller stood there, his mind racing as he processed everything he had just learned. He had come to this church looking for answers, but what he found was a man who was desperately trying to atone for a past that seemed impossible to escape. "We need to find the people you were involved with," Officer Miller said finally, his voice steady. "We need to bring them to justice." Pastor Samuel nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I understand," he said, "and I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make things right." As the room fell into an uneasy quiet, everyone realized that this wasn't just a story of redemption. It was a story of consequences, of facing the darkness that had haunted one man for so long. And no one knew where it would lead, but they all knew one thing for certain. The truth had come to light, and there was no turning back. The quiet that followed Pastor Samuel's confession seemed endless. It was as if the air itself had thickened, burdened with the weight of the truth. Officer Miller, his stern expression still locked on the pastor, seemed to be calculating the next steps. He knew this wasn't just a matter of law enforcement. It was much deeper. It involved trust, faith, and redemption, a mixture that had now become dangerously unstable. "I didn't want anyone to know," Pastor Samuel finally spoke, his voice trembling. "I've been running from my past for so long, hoping no one would find out. But I knew one day it would catch up to me. I just didn't think it would be like this." Daniel, still in shock, shook his head slowly. "But why keep it a secret? Why not tell us sooner?" "We trusted you, Pastor Samuel. We followed you." The question echoed in the room, and it struck Pastor Samuel like a slap in the face. He had always prided himself on being transparent, a man of honesty, Yet now he realized how badly he had failed. I thought if I could just help enough people, if I could just make enough good choices, maybe I could outrun it. Maybe I could prove that I was different, that I wasn't that man anymore. Outrun it. Officer Miller's voice was firm, but there was an odd sympathy beneath his words. You can't outrun your past. No matter how far you go, it will always be right behind you. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Everyone in the room seemed to be digesting the magnitude of the situation, but Daniel couldn't get past the image of the man he had once admired, standing before him, broken and vulnerable. Finally, Mrs. Ellen, who had been standing quietly in the corner, spoke up. But what do we do now? How do we move forward from here? Her voice was soft, almost fragile, but it carried the weight of the years she had spent as a part of this congregation. Pastor Samuel's eyes flickered to Mrs. Ellen, and a deep sadness washed over him. I don't know, he admitted. I only know that I can't change what I did. All I can do now is face the consequences, and if you'll let me, try to make amends. But I need your help to do that. The pain in his voice was palpable, and Mrs. Ellen's expression softened. We've always believed in you, Samuel. But this is going to be difficult for everyone to understand. I know, he whispered, and I don't expect forgiveness right away. I don't even expect it at all. But I need to face my past and try to make it right for the sake of the people I hurt. At that moment, the door to the small meeting room opened, and a young officer stepped inside. His eyes were wide, his face pale as he quickly approached Officer Miller. Sir, we have something, he said, his voice trembling. Officer Miller stood up, his sharp instincts kicking in. What is it? The young officer handed him a stack of papers. As Officer Miller scanned the documents, his face grew grim. It's more than we thought, he muttered. We found something. Something that could tie Pastor Samuel's past to the present. What is it? Daniel's voice cracked with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Evidence, Officer Miller replied, looking up from the papers. We've just uncovered something that ties him to a bigger criminal network. This isn't just about the past. This could be about something happening right now. Everyone in the room froze. The shock of the confession about Pastor Samuel's past had been overwhelming. But now this new information had turned the entire situation on its head. Pastor Samuel's face paled as he processed the officer's words. What do you mean? What's happening now? We've been tracking a group involved in human trafficking, and it looks like some of the people involved in that ring are connected to you. Officer Miller explained, his voice steady, but the urgency was clear. We've been able to trace phone records, transactions, and locations. It seems you were more involved in this than you've let on. Pastor Samuel's heart sank. I didn't know, he whispered, his voice shaking. I didn't know they were still operating. After I left that life, I thought I had cut all ties. But the past is never truly gone, is it? Officer Miller said grimly. People don't just disappear, Samuel. And neither does their influence. We need to find out everything you know, and we need to do it fast. The room was filled with a sense of urgency that had not been there before. Pastor Samuel's world had just become even more complicated. It wasn't enough to face his past anymore. He had to confront it in the present, to stop a dangerous network from continuing to destroy lives. I'll help, Pastor Samuel said, his voice barely audible. I'll help you. But I need to be sure that I can make this right. I need to do everything in my power to stop them. Officer Miller nodded. We'll work together. But we need to move quickly. For the first time, there was a sense of resolve in Pastor Samuel's eyes. It wasn't a victory, and it wasn't redemption. But it was something. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the first step toward making amends. As everyone in the room began to understand the gravity of the situation, they realized that the story of Pastor Samuel wasn't just one of redemption. It was a story of unfinished business, of facing the darkest parts of the past, and of trying to stop the cycle before it was too late. But even as they prepared to confront the dangerous truths that had come to light, They couldn't shake the nagging question that lingered in the back of their minds. Could Pastor Samuel truly escape the shadow of his past? The small meeting room felt colder now, as if the walls themselves had started to close in on them. Officer Miller's sharp gaze never left Pastor Samuel as they continued to discuss the emerging details. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on everyone, making even the simplest movements feel strained. Pastor Samuel sat with his hands clasped in front of him, staring down at the table. His mind raced with the possibilities. His past was catching up with him faster than he could comprehend. The truth had been hidden for so long, and now it was all spilling out in a way that he never expected. What had he done? And more importantly, how could he fix it? I should have known, Pastor Samuel muttered to himself, almost as if he were talking to the empty space around him. I should have known they'd come for me eventually. Pastor, we don't have time for regret, Officer Miller said sharply, his voice firm, but not without compassion. We need answers. If you want to make things right, you have to help us now. The words stung, but Samuel knew they were true. This wasn't the time for self-pity or hesitation. If he was ever going to make amends, this was the moment. But the question loomed, how much did he really know? How much of his past could he even remember with clarity? Tell us everything you know, Officer Miller pressed, his voice unwavering. Pastor Samuel's eyes flickered to the side, a wave of emotion washing over him. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew the truth now. The people he had once run with, the life he had tried to escape, wasn't so easily left behind. The sins of the past didn't just disappear when you changed your name or found a new path. They followed you. I was involved in some very dangerous things before I came to this town, Pastor Samuel began, his voice strained. I made choices that I regret, choices I wish I could take back. The people I worked with, they're still out there. I didn't know that they were still operating, but I suspect that some of the things I did before I left them have continued. He paused for a moment, the weight of his confession hanging in the air like a storm cloud. There's a man. His name is Marco Rossi. He was one of the leaders in the network I was involved with. He's powerful, dangerous. I thought that once I left, I could put him and his people behind me. But I was wrong. They never let me go. Daniel shifted in his seat, his expression full of concern. Marco Rossi, he asked. Who is he? What kind of danger are we talking about? Pastor Samuel looked up, his eyes tired but determined. He's part of a criminal syndicate, one that deals in human trafficking. They've been operating in the shadows, pulling strings and controlling people for years. I was involved with them long ago, but when I realized what they were doing, I left. Or at least I tried to. But they don't just let people go. They never forget. Officer Miller's jaw clenched. So you're telling us this syndicate is still active, and they're connected to you? Pastor Samuel nodded. Yes, I'm afraid so. And I'm afraid they're still watching me. Watching all of us. There was a chilling silence as the reality of his words sank in. This wasn't just a matter of confronting Pastor Samuel's past mistakes. This was a matter of confronting a dangerous criminal organization that had embedded itself deeply into the fabric of their town. You need to tell us everything you can about them, Officer Miller said urgently. Any names, any contacts. We need to bring them down once and for all, and we need your help to do it. Pastor Samuel took a deep breath and began to recall the details of his past involvement with the syndicate. He spoke slowly, his voice shaking as he remembered the dark and dangerous people he had once called associates. Every name he uttered felt like a betrayal, but he knew it was the only way to prevent more harm from being done. There were people he had worked with, people he had tried to distance himself from, each one more dangerous than the last. But it wasn't just the criminals who had caused him pain. It was the lives he had touched along the way. People who had trusted him. People whose lives he had affected, for better or for worse. I don't know how much longer I can keep running, Pastor Samuel admitted, his voice low. But I have to stop them. I have to stop Marco. I have to stop what I was a part of. Daniel, who had been listening intently, stood up and paced the room. What do we do now? He asked. How do we take them down? How do we stop this? We start by working together, Officer Miller said. We have to track down every lead. We have to follow the money, the people, the transactions. We have to expose them for what they are before they can do any more damage. The urgency in his voice was palpable. Time was running out, and Pastor Samuel knew it. Every minute spent in hesitation was another minute for the criminals to cover their tracks. He had to act now. I'll help you, Pastor Samuel said, his voice firm for the first time in what felt like hours. I don't know if I can undo all the wrongs I've done, but I can help you take them down. Together, we can stop this. The room fell silent as everyone processed what had just been said. There was no turning back now. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but it was the only way forward. Officer Miller gave a nod of approval. We have a long road ahead of us, but it's the right road. And we're in it together. The tension in the room didn't dissipate, but there was a shared understanding. The past had come back with a vengeance, but so had their resolve. They would fight for the truth. They would fight for justice, and perhaps in doing so, they could find a way to make things right. But as Pastor Samuel looked out the window, he couldn't shake the nagging thought in the back of his mind. Would this truly be the end of his past? Or was it only the beginning of something even darker? The days that followed were filled with urgency. Officer Miller and Pastor Samuel worked together, slowly piecing together the puzzle of Marco Rossi's criminal network. Every lead they followed seemed to open up a new door to something darker, something more dangerous. Samuel's knowledge of the underground world he had once been part of was invaluable, but it came at a cost. He had to confront his own demons, face the life he had tried to leave behind, and risk everything to expose the truth. There were nights when Samuel couldn't sleep, haunted by the faces of the people he had wronged. He'd made promises long ago that he couldn't keep. But now, this was his chance to make it right. The closer they got to Marco Rossi, the more pressure mounted. Samuel could feel it in his bones. There was no turning back. The walls were closing in. Then, one evening, Officer Miller received a tip. A woman, anonymous, had called the station and claimed to have information that could lead them straight to Marco Rossi. The call was cryptic, but it was enough to send them into action. The woman mentioned a safe house on the outskirts of town, one that had long been suspected of harboring criminals. If Rossi was there, this could be their chance to take him down once and for all. Miller didn't hesitate. He gathered his team, and the plan was set into motion. But as they prepared for the raid, Miller couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were walking into something far bigger than they had realized. Pastor Samuel stood outside the police station, his mind racing. He was torn. He had already sacrificed so much by helping the authorities, but now he had to take one final step. This was his moment to confront Marco Rossi, the man who had once controlled him, the man who had orchestrated so many terrible things. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest. It was time. As the police convoy rolled toward the safe house, Samuel was in the back of one of the cars, feeling a sense of unease settle in. He had a dark history with Rossi, and the thought of seeing him face to face again filled him with dread. But there was no turning back. The time had come to face the consequences of his past. The safe house was quiet as they approached, tucked away in the woods, isolated from the rest of the town. The officers moved swiftly, their training kicking in as they surrounded the building. Samuel stayed close to Miller, his breath shallow with nerves. He could feel his heart beating louder now, like a drum, as the team quietly positioned themselves. "We need to move fast," Miller whispered. "Stay close." Samuel nodded, his mind focused entirely on the mission. This was it. He had to be strong. He had to face his fear. And most of all, he had to make sure Marco Rossi was brought to justice. As the team entered the building, the air was thick with tension. Every corner, every shadow could be hiding something. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine as they moved through the dark hallways. The silence in the house was deafening, and all Samuel could hear was the sound of his own breath. They had been walking for what felt like an eternity when they finally reached the room where Rossi was believed to be hiding. Officer Miller motioned for the team to take position. They burst through the door, weapons drawn, and immediately scanned the room. There was no sign of Rossi, but before they could react, a voice echoed from behind them. "Well, well, it seems I've been found." Everyone turned in unison, their eyes falling on a figure standing in the doorway. It was Marco Rossi. He was calm, too calm, almost as if he had been expecting them. His dark eyes locked onto Samuel's, a twisted smirk playing on his lips. "I was wondering when you would show up," Rossi said, his voice cold and mocking. "Did you think you could run away from your past forever, Pastor?" Samuel's heart sank. It was like looking at a ghost, but worse. Rossi wasn't just a criminal. He was the embodiment of everything Samuel had tried to leave behind. "We're done here, Rossi," Miller said, stepping forward. "You're coming with us." Rossi let out a low laugh, his eyes narrowing. "You think it's that simple? You think you can just walk in here and arrest me?" Before anyone could respond, Rossi reached into his coat and pulled out a small device. Samuel's eyes widened as he recognized it. It was a detonator. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Rossi said, his smirk widening. "You may have found me, but you haven't found everything." A cold sweat broke out on Samuel's forehead as he realized what was happening. This wasn't just about arresting Rossi. This was about the destruction of everything he had worked for. The detonator could trigger an explosion. There were weapons in this building, and Rossi was ready to take them all down with him. "Put it down, Rossi," Miller shouted, but the criminal only laughed harder. "You don't get it, do you? I've already won." "You just don't know it yet," Rossi sneered. The tension in the room was unbearable. Samuel knew that they were running out of time. If they didn't act quickly, everything would be destroyed. His future, the lives of everyone in the building, and the chance to bring Rossi to justice. Without thinking, Samuel took a step forward. He had to act. He couldn't let this man win. He couldn't let his past win. "Marco," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "It doesn't have to end like this." Rossi's eyes flickered, just for a moment, before he looked at Samuel with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You think I'll listen to you now, after everything you did?" "I wasn't perfect," Samuel admitted, his voice low. "But I changed, and I'll do whatever it takes to stop you from destroying everything." In that moment, Samuel saw something in Rossi's eyes, a flicker of doubt, a glimpse of the man he had once been before power consumed him, but it was fleeting. Before Rossi could respond, Officer Miller acted, quickly disarming him and securing the detonator. The tension that had filled the room evaporated in an instant. Rossi was taken into custody, his reign of terror finally coming to an end. As the officers led him away, Samuel's knees buckled, and he slumped against the wall, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. It was over. The past had been confronted, and the future was no longer clouded by fear. In the days that followed, Pastor Samuel found a sense of peace he had never thought possible. The weight of his past was still with him, but now he could focus on making amends. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in years, it was a road full of hope. And as for Marco Rossi, the justice he had long evaded had finally caught up with him. The past no longer held power over Samuel. He had won. And in the end, it was the truth that had set him free. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with anticipation. Officer Miller stood firm, his hand gripping the cold metal of his weapon. The entire team was on high alert, eyes darting between Marco Rossi and the tense stillness of the room. Everyone knew the stakes were high, and no one could predict what would happen next. Rossi's cold smirk never left his face, but there was a dangerous edge in his eyes. He was cornered, but that didn't mean he was willing to give up. His fingers tightened around the detonator, the device a threat in his hands. He had nothing left to lose, and it seemed like he would take everyone down with him if he had to. "You think you've won." Rossi's voice was low, almost a growl. His eyes locked onto Samuel, and there was a cold satisfaction in them. "You're too late. You've walked right into my trap." The room fell silent. Everyone was waiting for the inevitable explosion, the sound that would mark the end of everything. Samuel's heart hammered in his chest. He could feel the tension in the air, thick like a storm about to break. But then something unexpected happened. "Marco," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "It doesn't have to end like this. You're not beyond saving." Rossi froze for a moment, the detonator still clenched in his hand. There was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, a brief moment where doubt seemed to creep in. The anger that had consumed him for years seemed to waver, just for a second. "You think you can change me?" Rossi spat, his expression twisting in fury. "I've already made my choices. I've done things that can't be undone." Samuel stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Rossi's. "You're right, Marco. You can't undo the past, but you can stop making it worse. You can still choose to walk away from this life. It's not too late." The words seemed to echo in the room, and for a moment, Rossi looked almost human again. The hardened criminal, the man who had caused so much pain, seemed to hesitate. It was clear now. He was torn. The years of violence, the blood on his hands, had led him to this point, but was there still a flicker of something else inside him? Miller didn't wait any longer. He moved swiftly, his team closing in around Rossi. In a blur of motion, they disarmed him. Rossi struggled, but it was no use. His fate had been sealed. The detonator fell from his hand, landing with a soft thud on the floor, its threat gone. As Rossi was handcuffed and led away, his face was filled with a mix of disbelief and rage. He had been brought down, not by force or violence, but by the truth. Samuel had given him a chance to choose a different path, but in the end, it wasn't enough to change the man Rossi had become. The weight of his actions had caught up with him, and there was no escaping the consequences anymore. Samuel stood still for a moment, watching as the officers took Rossi out of the house. His heart was still racing, but there was a sense of peace beginning to settle over him. The battle wasn't over. There would be more work to do, more healing to be done. But this was a victory not just for him, but for the people who had been hurt by Rossi's actions. The town could breathe a little easier now. Officer Miller walked up to Samuel, a grim but satisfied look on his face. "You did well. We couldn't have done this without you." Samuel nodded, but his mind was still processing everything that had just happened. "I don't know if I'm the one who deserves credit," he said softly. "I'm just trying to make up for my past." Miller placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression softening. "No one can change the past, Samuel. But you've made a difference. You've done something important today." Samuel looked at the door through which Rossi had just been led away. "Maybe. But I still have a long way to go." As the team began to file out, Samuel stayed behind for a moment. His mind wandered back to the days when he had lived a different life. The preacher he had once been, the man he had once been, seemed like a distant memory now. But the road to redemption was never easy, and Samuel knew it would take time to heal the wounds he had inflicted on others and on himself. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. The truth had been exposed, justice had been served, and Samuel knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning of his journey toward redemption. Final reflection. In the end, the truth had set him free. Samuel had confronted his past, faced his fears, and helped bring down one of the most dangerous criminals the town had ever known. But more than that, he had found peace in knowing that he could still make a difference. His past would never define him, and neither would the mistakes he had made. As he walked away from the house that night, Samuel felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. There would be more challenges ahead, but he was ready for them. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose again. And in the distance, the sound of the wind whispered a quiet promise. No matter how dark the past had been, there was always a chance for redemption. The future was his to shape.